A man lay motionless in a hospital bed, eyes closed, no movement. A machine breathed for him, one breath at a time. Everyone thought he was in a coma, but he heard it all. The woman he was going to marry stood beside his bed, a slight smile on her lips, her voice whispering in his ear. Die, Adrian. My future can't wait any longer. Then she walked out, her heels clicking rhythmically on the cold stone floor, and Adrian Vale, the man the whole city thought was dead, began to make his plans. If you're reading this story, please like and comment with the name of the city you're reading, so I know how far my story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because the worst is yet to come. The crash happened on a Tuesday. That was the detail Adrian Vale kept returning to in the absolute stillness of his own skull. Not the sound of metal folding, not the smell of burning rubber and something sweeter, more chemical, beneath it. But the day. Tuesday. A nothing day. A day for conference calls and coffee going cold on a mahogany desk. Not a day for dying. He hadn't died. That was the problem. Sterling Memorial Hospital occupied 11 floors of a building on the north edge of the financial district, and the private suite on the 8th floor had thick curtains that kept the morning gray and muted, the way expensive things always tried to pretend the outside world was someone else's problem. Adrian had paid for this room without knowing he'd ever need it. His assistant had arranged the hospital's preferred vendor contract 3 years ago, part of a broader insurance restructuring that had saved Vale Industries approximately $4 million annually. Adrian remembered signing the documents. He remembered thinking the hospitalization wing was for other people. The ceiling above his bed had a water stain shaped like a dog. He'd had 9 days to study it, 9 days of absolute stillness, 9 days of listening to his own heartbeat on a monitor, counting the intervals between the night nurse's rounds, cataloging every voice that entered his room against every silence that followed. 9 days of understanding with the slow, grinding clarity of a man who has had nothing to do but think that the crash had not been an accident. His body had simply stopped cooperating. That was the cleanest way Adrian could frame it. His mind still functioned, still processed, still raged and calculated and remembered. But the signal between intent and muscle had been severed somewhere in the wreckage of his nervous system, and the result was this: a billionaire trapped inside himself like a ship in a bottle, alive, aware, completely unable to prove either. The doctors used words like diffuse axonal injury and minimally conscious state, and we simply can't know, their voices careful and professional in the way that signaled they were protecting themselves as much as informing anyone. His neurologist, Dr. Elaine Forsyth, visited each morning at 7:15. She spoke to him in the clipped, slightly raised tone people reserve for pets and the possibly unconscious. She adjusted his chart. She occasionally touched the back of his hand with 2 fingers, checking something, and her touch was competent and entirely absent of warmth. None of them knew. Not the doctors. Not the nurses who worked the day shift, who spoke to each other over his body about their weekends and their grievances and a scheduling dispute with someone named Carla. Not the rotating security detail his own company had assigned to his door, men he recognized by their shoes, since that was the only view he had from the angle of his pillow. Black Oxford, size 12. Those were Marcus's. White sneakers with a lateral scuff. The new one, whose name he hadn't determined yet, and not Vivian. Vivian Cross had been his fiancée for 14 months. She was 34 years old, the daughter of a Boston investment family, educated at Wharton and then at the London School of Economics, fluent in 3 languages, surgically precise in any room she entered. Adrian had found those qualities compelling once. He'd mistaken precision for honesty, because precision looked like honesty from a distance if you weren't paying the right kind of attention. He had not been paying the right kind of attention. She visited every afternoon between 2 and 4. She wore black to the hospital, always black, tasteful, expensive black, the kind that whispered grief without screaming it. She sat in the chair beside his bed, and she held his hand, and she performed the role of devoted fiancée with the concentration of a woman who had rehearsed. Adrian had watched enough board presentations to recognize performance, the slight overcorrectness of her posture, the way her expression of concern held its shape just slightly too long before shifting. She was good. If he hadn't already known something was wrong, he might have believed her. The first day she'd come in after the crash, she'd stood at the foot of his bed and looked at him for a long time without speaking. He'd felt her looking. He'd felt the quality of her silence. Not grief, not fear, but something calculating, the pause of a person taking inventory. Then she'd said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Well." That single syllable had told him more than 100 words would have. By the fourth day, she was making calls in his room while she thought he slept. She stood at the window with her back to him and spoke in a low voice to people Adrian had never heard her mention. A man named Hargrove, someone referred to only as the attorney in Delaware. She spoke in partial sentences and deliberate omissions, the verbal shorthand of people who trusted each other or feared being overheard, and from the fragments Adrian assembled the shape of something that made the inside of his chest feel like ice. Transfer authorizations, proxy documentation, a phrase that recurred, before any medical review can complicate things. He lay there, and he listened, and he could not move. The thing about complete physical paralysis that no one prepared you for, that he hadn't known to prepare for, was the rage. It didn't express itself as heat. It was cold. Cold and methodical and absolutely relentless. A pressure building behind his eyes and his sternum with nowhere to go, no outlet, no relief. He couldn't clench his jaw. Couldn't tighten his fists, couldn't even alter his own breathing, because the machine handled that too. All he could do was think, and thinking without action is its own particular kind of suffering, especially for a man who had spent 20 years building things through sheer controlled aggression. He thought about the crash. The car had been his, a custom-built S-Class, armored, serviced every 90 days by a certified Mercedes technician. Theo Garland had been driving. Theo, who had been with Adrian for 11 years, who had picked him up from airports at 2 a.m. without complaint, who kept a photograph of his daughter on the sun visor, and who always wore his seatbelt. The police report said the failure had been in the braking system. A cascade failure, they'd called it, unusual, but not impossible for a vehicle of that age and use profile. Adrian had replaced that vehicle 8 months ago. The S-Class was 9 months old. He had thought about that fact approximately 400 times in 9 days, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone you knew had something wrong under it, but couldn't quite confirm until the light hit right. The braking system of a 9-month-old custom vehicle did not fail in a cascade. That was not a thing that happened. That was a thing that was made to happen by someone who understood how to make it look like it happened naturally. Theo had been killed on impact. Adrian had not been wearing his seatbelt, which was the single anomaly in the crash data that the investigators had mentioned twice, and then, apparently, stopped following. He'd been thrown clear. He'd survived with a traumatic brain injury, 4 broken ribs, and a shattered radius in his left arm. Damage that should have killed him, that by any mechanical logic had been designed to kill him, and that had failed to do so through some cold alignment of angle and trajectory that no one had engineered for. Someone had tried to kill him. Someone had killed Theo instead. And that person came to visit him every afternoon between 2 and 4. On the 9th day at 2:18 in the afternoon, Vivian leaned over his bed to adjust his pillow, a gesture that looked tender to anyone watching, and brought her mouth close to his ear and said, in a voice so low it barely existed, "Hurry up and die, Adrian. My future can't wait forever." Then she straightened, smoothed his blanket, smiled at the monitoring equipment as though it had said something pleasant, and left. He lay there in the gray filtered light, and he thought, there it is. And then he thought, I need to find a way out of here. The night shift began at 11. Hannah Mercer came on at 11:15, always a few minutes late, always slightly out of breath in a way that suggested she'd run from the parking structure rather than be formally docked again. Adrian had established her schedule within the first 3 days. She was 29, maybe 30. Her voice suggested someone who'd grown up somewhere with winters, flat vowels, the north end of some industrial state. She worked efficiently and without theater, which distinguished her from every other person who entered his room. She didn't perform concern. She just did things, checked his lines, adjusted his positioning, noted his stats with the minimal sounds of a person focused on the task, rather than on being seen doing the task. And she talked to him. Not in the loud, simplified way the day nurses sometimes did. There we go, all comfy now, but normally. Conversationally, the way you'd speak to someone sitting across a table who happened to be quiet. She'd started on the third night, almost as though it embarrassed her. She'd been changing his IV and she'd said without looking up, "I finished that novel I was telling you about." Well, I wasn't telling you about it, but I was thinking about it while I was in here, and I think you would have hated the ending. The guy just gives up after everything. It felt cheap. She'd gone quiet for a moment. Anyway, for what it's worth, I don't think you're as gone as they say. That sentence had hit Adrian somewhere below the sternum like a thrown weight. He'd spent 3 days cataloging her routine before he understood that it wasn't method or professionalism that made her different from the others. It was that she was paying attention, actual attention, not to his vitals, not to his status as a high-profile patient in a lawsuit-adjacent situation, but to him, to the specific quality of silence in the room when she was in it. She noticed things. He could tell from the slight adjustments she made, a fraction more pressure when she repositioned his arm, a pause before she spoke that suggested she was reading the room rather than just occupying it. On the 7th night, she'd read to him. She'd pulled a paperback from the pocket of her scrubs, unceremonious about it, and she'd read a chapter of something. He'd caught the title only partially, something with harbor in it, and her voice had settled into the prose like she'd read aloud before, maybe to someone who needed it, and the chapter had been good, dark around the edges, and Adrian had felt something he hadn't felt since before the crash, which was simply present, not trapped, not calculating, just there, in the room, in the story, in the specific weight of a voice reading to him like he was worth reading to. On the 9th night, the night after Vivian's whisper, Hannah came in at 11:19 and changed his IV and stood for a moment looking at his left hand, which rested on the blanket in the particular way it always rested, palm down, fingers loose. She said, "Your index finger moved this morning." He hadn't known that. He'd felt something, a deep, resistant tremor, more like intention than movement, not connected to anything deliberate, but he hadn't known it had produced visible result. "It was small," she said. "Barely. Dr. Forsyth's notes don't mention it. I checked." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking. "I'm not going to say anything yet," she said, "because I've been watching, and I think there are people who want you to stay exactly as you are. And if I report progress to the wrong person at the wrong time, I don't know what happens next." A pause. "I want to be wrong about that." She wasn't wrong about that. "So here's what I'm going to do," she said very quietly. "I'm going to keep this between us for now. And if I'm right, if you can hear me, you're going to have to help me help you." He concentrated on his left hand with everything he had. The effort was enormous, like trying to lift something underwater, resistance in every direction, his nervous system sluggish and uncooperative, and gradually, incrementally, not quite working. But his index finger moved. He felt it move. It was barely a millimeter. It might have been nothing. Hannah went still. Then she said, "Okay." And that single word, in the dark of the hospital room with the monitoring equipment beeping its steady and different rhythm, was the first good thing that had happened to Adrian Vale since Tuesday. She came back the next night with a laminated card. It was the kind of thing you'd make yourself, cut from cardstock, letters in 2 rows, A through Z, numbers below, a few common words at the bottom: yes, no, stop, pain. She'd covered it in clear tape so it wouldn't damage from handling. She set it on the blanket near his left hand, and she said, without preamble, "I'm going to point to letters. You move your finger when I hit the right one. It's slow, I know, but we've got time." They worked for 40 minutes the first night. His concentration fractured repeatedly. The effort of translating will into that tiny movement was exhausting in a way that bore no relationship to physical fatigue, more like trying to hold a signal through interference, the connection dropping and rebuilding, dropping and rebuilding. But they got through 3 words: NOTACCIDENT. Hannah read it twice. She sat back slightly in her chair and she looked at the card, and then at his face, and then at the card again. "No," she said. "I didn't think so." They kept going. The next night, VIVIAN. The night after, KILLED. THEO. Each session left Adrian wrung out in a way he couldn't express, the effort of pushing through the nerve damage accumulating like weight, his concentration narrowing to a single point of light at the center of a great dark room. But the sessions were also the only hours in which he felt like himself. Not a body in a bed, not a legal problem, not a convenient vegetable in someone else's plan, but Adrian Vale, who had built a $3 billion industrial company from a startup in a rented office in Cleveland, who had won negotiations against men twice his age and 3 times his resources, who did not give up. He did not give up. On the 12th night, he spelled out MILESDONOVAN. Hannah wrote it down on the notepad she'd started keeping in her scrubs pocket. Who is he? Adrian waited, then a TTORNEY TRUST. She understood. She'd been understanding faster lately, anticipating the shape of what he was building toward, her mind quick and pragmatic in a way that reminded him of the best people he'd worked with, the ones who could hold the structural logic of a problem in their heads without needing it spelled out completely. You want me to contact him? Yes. Without going through the hospital's official channels? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That's going to be complicated. He waited. I'll figure it out, she said. She did. Miles Donovan had been Adrian's attorney for 16 years, since before Vale Industries had existed under that name, since the two of them had been navigating a startup's legal exposure from a conference table in a rented office in Cleveland at ages 27 and 31 respectively. Miles was 60 now, meticulous, and possessed of a particular kind of legal intelligence that most people mistook for caution, but was actually the opposite, a profound understanding of exactly how far you could push before something broke, and how to push past that point without leaving fingerprints. He picked up his personal cell on the second ring when Hannah called from the parking structure after her shift. She'd gotten his number from the hospital's authorized contact list. Adrian had listed him as emergency counsel, but she'd called from her own phone, away from the building, which was the kind of careful thinking that Adrian was increasingly grateful for. She told Miles, "Your client is awake. He can communicate. He says the crash was deliberate. He says Vivian Cross is dismantling his company from his hospital room, and he needs you to move." There was a long silence on the line. Then Miles said, "I'll need something from him, a verification, something only he would know." Hannah came back the next night and relayed this. Adrian thought for a moment and then spelled out a phrase in pieces, a reference to a specific clause in a contract modification they'd made in 2019 that Miles had argued against, and Adrian had insisted on, and that had turned out, 3 years later, to be the most consequential decision either of them had made in a decade. 18 words, taking 40 minutes to spell, his finger hitting the card with the grinding deliberateness of a man trying to run underwater. Miles received the message through Hannah the following morning. He didn't need another day to act. What Miles did in the next 48 hours was the legal equivalent of a controlled demolition. Precise, structural, and invisible until the moment it wasn't. He filed emergency injunctions in 3 jurisdictions. He contacted the independent auditors who maintained Vale Industries' external review protocols and invoked the corporate emergency provisions that Vivian apparently hadn't known existed, buried in a subsidiary bylaw from 2017 that Adrian had put there almost as an afterthought after a hostile takeover attempt against a competitor had made him think seriously about his own exposure. He froze the offshore accounts that Hannah had reported were being moved. He contacted a federal financial crimes investigator named Delaney, someone Miles had worked with twice before on separate matters, and presented him with a preliminary summary of what Hannah had overheard in the hospital room. Delaney opened a file. He also quietly asked someone to re-examine the crash report. None of this was visible from inside the hospital room. From inside the hospital room, everything continued to look exactly the same. Vivian arriving each afternoon in her tasteful black, performing her grief, conducting her calls at the window, occasionally speaking to the attorneys she'd stationed in the building's lobby, who were, as Adrian now knew from Hannah's careful reconnaissance, working through a document transfer that would require only his medical proxy approval, not his direct signature. The proxy had not yet been legally transferred. That was the critical vulnerability in her timeline. She needed one more step, a formalized medical incapacity ruling or something close enough to function as one, before she could move without challenge. She was accelerating. Adrian could feel the acceleration in the shortened calls, the clipped instructions, the way she now checked her phone while sitting beside him, no longer bothering with the performance of full attention. She was running out of time, and she didn't know why yet. On the 14th day, two things happened. The first, Adrian moved his left hand 4 inches across the blanket. Intentional, controlled movement. Not a tremor, not a reflex. A deliberate, exhausting, victorious 4 inches that left him spent and shaking internally in a way the monitors caught only as a slight elevation in heart rate. Hannah saw it during her shift and pressed her lips together and said nothing for a long moment, and then said quietly, "You're getting stronger." He was getting stronger. The second, Grant Vale came to see him. Grant was Adrian's stepbrother, 6 years younger, the son of Adrian's stepmother from a second marriage that had preceded and outlasted his father by a decade. They had never been close in the way that family was supposed to mean close, though they had been functional, occasionally genuinely warm in the way that people can be when they've survived the same specific domestic wreckage. Grant had worked in Vale Industries' real estate division for 7 years, not spectacularly but competently, a man who occupied the lower gradient of the family name without embarrassing it. He came in alone, which was unusual. He usually deferred to Vivian's visiting schedule, arriving when she was present, leaving when she left. He was thin in the way some people got thin under sustained stress, the flesh pulling back from the angles of the face. He sat in the chair beside the bed, and he looked at Adrian for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "I think I made a mistake." He stopped, started again. "She told me it was just a reallocation, a reorganization. She said you'd agreed to it before the crash, that you'd discussed transitioning the proxies if anything happened to you, and I believed her because—" He stopped again, looked at his hands. "Because it was easier to believe her than to think about the alternative." He looked up. The driver, Theo. She knew him, Adrian. She knew his schedule. "She asked me 3 weeks before the crash whether you'd been using him consistently." He exhaled, something rough and uneven. "I didn't make the connection until last week, and now I can't stop making it." His eyes were wet, which surprised Adrian, because Grant generally performed his emotions behind a scrim of professional restraint. "I don't know what to do," Grant said. "I have documents, things she gave me to hold. She said it was just internal transfer records, but I looked at them, Adrian. I looked at them properly this time, and they're not transfer records. They're forged authorization forms. Your signature on documents you never saw." He stood up abruptly, like the chair had become uncomfortable. "I'm going to figure this out," he said, not to Adrian exactly, more to the room, to the situation, to whatever version of himself he was trying to become. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to figure it out." He left without looking at the monitoring equipment, without adjusting the blanket, without any of the gestures people used to demonstrate that they'd been there. Just walked out, his footsteps uncertain in the corridor, fading. Adrian lay in the gray light and thought about Grant's voice when he'd said, "I think I made a mistake." The specific quality of it, not guilt exactly, which could be performed, but something raw, the sound of a person confronting the distance between who they thought they were and what they'd actually done. He thought about Theo. Theo, who had a daughter whose photograph he'd kept on the sun visor, whose name Adrian had never asked because names were for relationships, and he'd kept the relationship professional, which was its own kind of failure he hadn't examined until now. Theo had died in a car that had been made to kill. He'd died doing his job, with no idea that the job had become a hazard, with no warning, with no time to protect himself. The rage came back cold and precise and clarifying. On the 15th day, Vivian brought lawyers to the room. 2 of them, men Adrian didn't recognize, carrying document portfolios, wearing the specific brand of conservative suit that said transactional work, not litigation. They sat up near the foot of the bed with the practiced efficiency of people who had done uncomfortable things in uncomfortable places before. Vivian spoke to them in a low voice, and one of them nodded repeatedly and produced a thick folder. "This is standard," Vivian said to the room, to no one specifically. Her voice was smooth, entirely under control. "Given the circumstances, the board has a responsibility to ensure continuity. This is just a formality." The lawyer with the folder moved to the side of the bed and placed a single document on the blanket near Adrian's right hand. It was a medical proxy transfer, the final piece. If his hand moved anywhere near that document, or if they could get the right kind of involuntary movement on camera, they could argue later that it constituted... Adrian opened his eyes. He hadn't planned it. His body had been building toward it for days, the neurological connections slowly re-establishing, Hannah's careful work each night progressively unlocking what the crash had shut down. And it happened then, in that moment, in that room, with two lawyers and a forged document, and Vivian Cross standing at the foot of his bed with the expression of a woman 3 minutes from everything she wanted. His eyes opened. The lawyer with the folder went completely still. The other one took a step back. Vivian's face, he saw it happen in real time, the control fracturing, the performance breaking apart, and then reassembling with tremendous effort, her jaw tightening, her eyes recalibrating. For just 1 second, she looked at him with something that wasn't grief and wasn't care and wasn't any of the things she'd been performing for 14 months. Then she smiled. "Adrian," she said. Her voice was warm, practiced. "Thank God. You're back." He looked at her. His throat was dry, his voice had not been used in 15 days, and when he spoke it came out damaged and hoarse and quiet, barely carrying across the room. He said, "Get out of my room." She didn't move. "All of you," he said, "take those papers and get out of my room." The lawyer with the folder looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Adrian. The monitoring equipment continued its steady, indifferent rhythm. "Adrian," she said, still warm, "you're confused. You've been through something traumatic and you need to rest. These documents are just... I know what they are." His voice was gaining something, not volume, but weight. "I've been in this room for 15 days. I know exactly what they are, and I know why you brought them, and I know what you said to me 9 days ago." The warmth left Vivian's face like a light going out. In the corridor outside the door, footsteps approached. Multiple sets, purposeful, different from the routine sounds of a hospital floor. The door opened and Miles Donovan walked in, and behind him were two people Adrian didn't recognize but whose bearing he'd been expecting. Federal investigators, not in uniform, but not pretending to be anything else. Vivian turned. Miles said, "Ms. Cross." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Adrian. "You've been awake," she said. "Yes." Her jaw moved. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not remorse, not fear yet. Something colder than both. She was still calculating. Adrian had watched her calculate for 14 months and he recognized the look. "You can't prove anything," she said. Miles placed a folder on the end of the bed. Deliberately, precisely, the gesture of a man who had been waiting a long time to make it. "We have the original proxy documents and the forgeries. We have the offshore account transfer records. We have recordings from this room." He paused. "And we have a witness who heard you discuss the vehicle modification with the contractor you hired." Vivian went still. "His name was Theodore Garland," Adrian said. His voice had steadied into something flat and terrible. "He had a daughter. He drove me for 11 years. And you killed him." The investigator behind Miles said her name, her full legal name, and began reading from a small card, and Vivian Cross stood in the private suite of Sterling Memorial Hospital in her tasteful black mourning clothes while the empire she'd spent 14 months trying to steal was put back exactly where it belonged. She didn't cry. He hadn't expected her to. People like Vivian didn't cry when they were caught. They started building the defense. He could see it happening even as the investigator spoke, her mind already pivoting, already looking for the exits in the argument, the angles of mitigation. She would find good lawyers. She would fight. But she was going to fight from a position of complete exposure, with every document compromised and every account frozen, and a federal investigation that had already been running for 3 days. Miles stayed after the investigators left with Vivian. He stood at the end of the bed and looked at Adrian for a moment, with the expression of a man processing something large. "You want to tell me how long?" he said. "Since the fourth day," Adrian said. "Maybe earlier." "And the nurse?" "Hannah." "Yes." Miles nodded slowly. "I'll want to speak with her." "She gets whatever she asks for," Adrian said. "Whatever she needs, that's non-negotiable." "Understood." Miles picked up the folder he'd placed on the bed. "The board meeting is in 72 hours. We have enough to restore your authority without challenge. The injunctions held and Forsyth's independent medical review is already scheduled for tomorrow morning. Grant Vale has submitted a voluntary testimony package." "I know." Miles looked at him. "You knew about Grant?" "He came to see me 2 days ago, before he had any reason to think I was aware of anything." Adrian's voice was still rough, still recovering, but the cadence of it was coming back, the measured pace of a man who chose his words because he meant each one. "He told me what he'd done. I think he was confessing to someone he thought couldn't hear him. And I think he was telling the truth." He paused. "He doesn't get a free pass, but he gets the chance to earn something back." Miles absorbed this without comment, which was one of the things Adrian valued most about him, the ability to receive information without editorializing it in real time. "There's one more thing," Adrian said. "Theo's family." Miles looked up. "His daughter. Find her. Whatever she needs. Education, housing, whatever she needs going forward. Not as a settlement, not through lawyers, as a direct obligation. Mine. That can be arranged." "It will be arranged," Adrian said. Miles nodded. He picked up his bag, moved toward the door, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you're not dead." Adrian looked at the ceiling, the water stain shaped like a dog. "So am I," he said. The room went quiet. Miles left. The monitor maintained its rhythm. The afternoon light had shifted while everything had happened, the gray becoming something warmer, less filtered, touching the edge of the curtain in a way it hadn't managed in 15 days. Hannah came on shift at 11:19. She came through the door at her usual pace, slightly breathless, the scrubs with the right pocket that held the notepad, and she stopped when she saw that his eyes were open, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all. Then she said, "Well, good evening." "Good evening," Adrian said, his voice still rough, still coming back. She moved to check his lines, professional, unhurried. She checked his stats. She made a note. When she turned back toward him, her expression was the same as it always was. Careful, pragmatic, paying the specific kind of attention that had nothing to do with performance. "I heard they arrested her," she said. "Yes." "And Miles came." "He came." She was quiet for a moment, then, "How do you feel?" Adrian thought about that. He thought about Theo's daughter and Grant's wet eyes and Vivian's face when the warmth left it. He thought about 15 days of absolute stillness, of rage without outlet, of learning to move a single finger with the concentrated effort of a man refusing to be buried. He thought about a paperback pulled from a scrub's pocket and a voice reading to him in the dark like he was worth reading to. "Better," he said. "Getting there." Hannah nodded. She pulled the laminated card from her pocket, the alphabet card, A through Z, the common words at the bottom, and she set it on the tray table, looked at it for a moment. "Guess you won't be needing this anymore," she said. "Keep it," Adrian said. She looked at him. "Keep it," he said again. "I might want to remember what this was." She folded the card carefully and put it back in her pocket. She turned to leave. "Hannah," she stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for paying attention." She stood in the doorway for a moment with her back to him, and he couldn't see her expression and didn't need to. Then she said simply, "Get some rest. You've got a board meeting in 72 hours. She left. Adrian lay in the room that no longer felt like a prison, and he looked at the ceiling and the water stain that looked like a dog, and he thought about everything that was waiting on the other side of the next 72 hours. The board, the company, the federal investigation, the structural damage that Vivian had done that would take months to fully assess and repair, Grant's uncertain future, Theo's family, the long work of rebuilding not just a company, but his own understanding of who he'd allowed into the center of his life and why. He thought about Hannah reading to him in the dark. The first thing he was going to do, when he was strong enough to do it, was find out the name of that book. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent business. Traffic, light, the ordinary machinery of people living their lives without knowing that in a private suite on the 8th floor of Sterling Memorial Hospital, a man had just started taking his back. The board meeting was in 72 hours. Adrian spent the first 12 of those hours being assessed, measured, and cautiously optimistic at by Dr. Elaine Forsyth, who arrived the morning after his eyes opened with the slightly stunned expression of a professional whose patient had declined to follow the expected trajectory. She was thorough. She ran tests that required him to track light with his eyes, to respond to commands, to attempt controlled movements with both hands. She asked him questions in the clipped, careful tone of someone recalibrating in real time, not warm, but honest, which Adrian respected more. "Your recovery rate is atypical," she said, making notes without looking at him. "Good atypical or bad atypical?" She glanced up. "I'm not sure yet." She made another note. "You have significant neurological work ahead of you. What you're experiencing now is not full recovery. It's a return of baseline function. The next several weeks will determine how much of the remaining deficit resolves and how much is permanent." "What's the range?" "Optimistically, 70 to 80% of pre-injury motor function within 6 months. Realistically, 60. There may be chronic fatigue. Cognitive processing under stress may be slower than you're used to." She paused. "You should prepare for the possibility that you will not be the same as you were." Adrian looked at her. "I'm already not the same as I was." She absorbed this without response, made a final note, and told him she'd be back in the afternoon. She left with the efficient stride of a woman who had 17 other patients and no time for philosophical observations, which Adrian found unexpectedly somewhat comforting. Miles arrived at 9. He came with coffee. He didn't offer Adrian and a leather portfolio that he opened immediately, standing at the foot of the bed in his overcoat, because Miles Donovan did not sit down during working meetings if he could avoid it. He laid out the situation with the compressed clarity that Adrian had paid him for 16 years to produce. The offshore accounts, 3 of them, totaling approximately $48 million, had been frozen under the emergency injunctions. The forensic accounting team had traced the transfer authorizations back through 2 shell entities to a law firm in Delaware that Vivian had been using as a conduit. The law firm was now cooperating. The lead partner had apparently decided, with some promptness, that his continued licensure was worth more than client confidentiality with someone facing federal conspiracy charges. The forged proxy documents were in federal custody. A handwriting analyst had already confirmed what the forensics would confirm more thoroughly, that Adrian's signature on 4 separate authorization forms had been produced by someone who was skilled but not perfect, with microscopic pressure inconsistencies that the originals didn't carry. The crash investigation had been formally reopened. A second examination of the vehicle's braking system, what remained of it, had found evidence of targeted tampering in the anti-lock brake module. Someone had introduced a compound into the hydraulic line that degraded under sustained heat and pressure, producing exactly the kind of cascade failure that had been described in the original report, but deliberately. The compound was traceable. The investigator working the case, a woman named Delaney, who Miles described as thorough to the point of being frightening, had already identified 2 men who'd had access to the vehicle in the 2 weeks preceding the crash. One of them had a prior connection to a private security contractor that Vivian's personal accounts had paid $40,000 to in the month before the accident. "She'll argue she didn't know what the payment was for," Miles said. "Can she make that stick?" "Her lawyers will try. They won't succeed." He turned a page. "She's retained Harmon Price." Adrian recognized the name. Harmon Price was a defense attorney in the specific tier of the profession that existed to handle cases where the client was guilty, and the question was only how guilty, and of what, and with what consequences. He was expensive and effective, and his involvement confirmed that Vivian had moved past denial into damage containment. "Let her have Price," Adrian said. "The documents are real. The wire transfers are real. Theo is dead." Miles looked at him briefly. Then he turned another page. "The board," he said. 12 members. Currently, 7 are aligned with the proxy documentation Vivian submitted. They believe it was legitimate and that her authority over operational decisions was sanctioned by you prior to the crash. When I contacted them yesterday to inform them of the situation, 3 of the 7 immediately requested independent counsel and suspended their cooperation with Vivian's initiatives. 2 are unreachable. 2, he paused. 2 have retained lawyers and are indicating they may have participated in good faith, which is a way of saying they're preparing to cooperate. Who are the 2? Miles named them. One was a man named Bertrand Lyle, who'd been on the board for 4 years and who Adrian had never entirely trusted, not for any specific reason, but for the general reason that Bertrand Lyle worked very hard at appearing trustworthy. The other was Patricia Osai, who had joined the board 18 months ago through a nomination process that Adrian now examined, in retrospect, with different eyes. Osei came through the nominations committee, Adrian said. She did. I'm looking at the process. Look harder. Miles made a note. He closed the portfolio, looked at Adrian with the expression he used when he had something to say that wasn't in the documents. Grant is waiting outside, he said. Adrian had been expecting this. Send him in. He has the documents with him, hard copies, digital backup, chain of custody documented. Miles paused. He came to my office yesterday evening. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. Probably hasn't. He's asking for a chance to speak to you directly, before the board meeting. Miles picked up his portfolio. My opinion, for whatever it's worth, he was used. That doesn't absolve him. But there's a distinction between complicit and naive, and I think it matters here. I know it matters, Adrian said. Send him in. Miles left. There was a pause of perhaps 2 minutes, long enough that Adrian could picture Grant in the corridor doing whatever Grant did when he was preparing himself, the particular way his stepbrother had always needed a moment before difficult rooms. Then the door opened. Grant Vale looked worse than Adrian had expected, and he had expected worse than usual. The weight loss was more visible in daylight than it had been in the filtered afternoon of 2 days ago. His face had the carved, stripped quality of someone burning through reserves. His suit was correct, but his tie was slightly off-center, and Grant had never worn a tie off-center in his professional life, which told Adrian something about where his attention was and wasn't. He sat in the chair beside the bed, put a manila folder on his knee, and kept his hand flat on top of it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Grant said, You heard me, 2 days ago. Yes. Everything. Yes. Grant's jaw worked. He looked at the folder. I need you to know that I genuinely believe the transfers were authorized. She showed me documentation. It looked legitimate. It looked like something you'd set up as a contingency. I know. I'm not saying that to minimize. Grant. Adrian's voice was flat, not angry, just direct. I know. I heard you 2 days ago. You told me the truth when you thought I couldn't hear you, which means you told me the truth. We can skip the part where you justify yourself. Grant looked up. What I need, Adrian said, is to know everything, not a summary. Everything. Every conversation with her, every document she gave you, every instruction, every name she mentioned, every payment you're aware of. All of it. I have it, Grant said. He put the folder on the bed. It's all here. I went through my email, my phone, every record I had. I also wrote out everything I remember from verbal conversations. Dates, locations, what she said. He paused. There's something in there about a man named Hargrove. She mentioned him 3 times over the past 2 months. I looked him up. He's a corporate intelligence consultant, the kind companies hire when they want to gather information without leaving obvious footprints. Adrian had heard the name from Hannah, who'd overheard Vivian's calls. What do you know about him? Not much. She never used his full name when I was present, but I have a phone number she called once from my office. She borrowed my landline, said her cell was dead. I wrote down the number while she was on the call. Give that to Miles. Already did, last night. Adrian looked at his stepbrother. The stripped face, the off-center tie, the hands that weren't quite still on his knees. He thought about what Miles had said. A distinction between complicit and naive. He thought about Grant standing at the foot of his bed 2 days ago, confessing to a man he thought couldn't hear him because the guilt had become too heavy to keep carrying alone. "The board meeting is in 60 hours, Adrian said. "I need you there." Grant blinked. "You want me at the board meeting?" "I need the testimony package you gave Miles presented in person. It carries more weight coming from you directly than as a document submission. You understand the context in a way written records can't fully convey." He paused. "And I need the board to see you standing on the right side of this. Some of them are going to have very limited choices about how they respond," Adrian said. "That's not your problem. Your problem is showing up and telling the truth with the same clarity you used when you thought I was unconscious." He held Grant's gaze. "Can you do that?" Grant was quiet for a moment. Something worked through his expression. Not resolution exactly, but the thing that comes before resolution. The acknowledgement that there's only one direction that doesn't lead somewhere worse. "Yes," he said. "Good." Adrian picked up the folder from the bed. Felt the weight of it. Thought about Vivian borrowing Grant's landline to call a number she didn't want traced to her own phone, and felt the cold, specific contempt of recognizing the depth of someone's calculation. "Go get some sleep. You look like you're about to fall over." Grant almost smiled. Didn't quite make it. He stood, straightened his jacket, didn't fix the tie, moved toward the door, and then stopped. "The driver," he said. "Theo." "Yes." "I didn't know," Grant said. I need you to know that. I didn't know that was what she was asking when she asked about his schedule. I thought she was trying to manage your logistics." "I know," Adrian said. Grant left. Adrian sat with the folder in his lap and the monitor maintaining its rhythm and the morning light doing what morning light did, and he thought about Theo's daughter, whose name he still didn't know, and about the specific quality of violence that required borrowing someone else's phone and paying $40,000 and knowing a man's schedule, and then building in enough technical complexity that a 9-month-old car failed as though it had aged 12 years overnight. The physical therapist arrived at 10:30. A compact, businesslike woman named Rosa, who had apparently been briefed on his situation with minimal emotional preparation because she walked in, looked at him, said, "Let's see what we're working with," and proceeded to spend 45 minutes testing his motor function with the thorough impersonality of someone assessing a machine. It was, Adrian thought, exactly the right approach. She told him his left side was stronger than his right, which was counterintuitive given his dominant hand, and that the recovery pattern suggested the injury had been asymmetrical in a way that might ultimately work in his favor. She gave him 3 exercises to do in the bed. She told him they would hurt. They did. She left. He did them again. At 1:15, the federal investigator Delaney came. She was not what Adrian had expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Late 40s, close-cropped hair, a suit that was correct rather than expensive. She had the specific kind of eye contact that investigators developed. Steady, attentive, not aggressive, simply recording everything. She set a small recorder on the table beside his bed, stated the date and the relevant case identification, and looked at him. "You were conscious for the duration of your hospitalization," she said. It wasn't a question. "From approximately day 3. And you observed Ms. Cross conducting activities in your room that you believed were related to the fraudulent transfer of your assets." "I didn't believe it. I heard it." She nodded. "I'm going to need a full accounting of what you heard and when. Dates, times, specific language, if you can recall it." "I can recall all of it," Adrian said. "I had 15 days and nothing to do but remember." Something shifted very slightly at the corner of Delaney's mouth. Not quite a smile. "Then let's start from the beginning." They went for 2 hours. Adrian talked and Delaney listened and occasionally asked a question so precise and narrow that it was like watching someone insert a needle into exactly the right place, not to cause pain but to extract something specific. She was good. She didn't lead him and she didn't editorialize, and she caught 2 details that Adrian hadn't flagged as significant, but that she clearly recognized as load-bearing. The specific timing of one of Vivian's calls relative to a board decision, and a name that had appeared in the calls that connected, through a chain Delaney apparently already had partially mapped, to the contractor who'd accessed the vehicle. When they finished, she turned off the recorder and looked at him with the same level of attention she'd maintained throughout. "The man who died," she said. "Theodore Garland." "Yes. His family has been contacted about the investigation. They've been informed it was not an accident." She paused. "I wanted you to know that they know." Something tightened in Adrian's chest. "His daughter. 14 years old, she's with her maternal grandmother." Delaney picked up the recorder. "We'll be in touch." She left. The room was quiet. Adrian lay there and thought about a 14-year-old girl whose father had driven to work one morning and not come back, and he felt the weight of that in a way that had nothing to do with legal exposure or financial obligation. It was just weight. The specific weight of knowing that someone had died in a radius of consequence that you occupied, and that the dying had been intentional, and that the person who'd intended it had sat beside your bed and held your hand. Vivian was smart. He'd always known she was smart. What he'd failed to understand, what the 14 months had obscured, was that smart and ruthless without conscience wasn't intelligence at all. It was just efficiency in the wrong direction. It produced clean paperwork and covered tracks and $40,000 payments to contractors, and a fiancée who could cry on cue, and it also produced a dead man at the bottom of a ravine who'd done nothing more dangerous than show up for work. He did the exercises again. At 4 o'clock, Miles returned. His expression was different from the morning. Not alarmed, but sharpened, the look of a man who'd received information that had changed the shape of what he'd been looking at. He closed the door behind him. He stood for a moment without opening the portfolio. "The Hargrove number," he said. "We traced it. And he's not a corporate intelligence consultant." Miles's voice was level, but there was something underneath it. "He's a former federal contractor. He did work for 3 private equity firms and 2 pharmaceutical companies over the past decade, all of which would be unremarkable, except..." He paused. "Delaney's team ran his financial records under the investigation authorization. 12 days before your crash, Hargrove received a wire transfer of $60,000 from an account that traces back to the same Delaware firm managing Vivian's conduit entities." Adrian waited. "He's not the man who accessed the vehicle," Miles said. "He's the man who found the men who accessed the vehicle. He's the coordinator." He paused again, longer this time. "And 3 days ago, Hargrove left the country." The room was quiet. "Where?" "Unknown. His passport was used at JFK on a flight to Zurich. After Zurich, nothing." Miles finally opened the portfolio, though he didn't look at it. "Delaney has a flag on him. Interpol has been notified, but Adrian..." He looked up. "If Hargrove was the coordinator, then Vivian had a layer between herself and the operation that was specifically designed to be cut away in exactly this kind of situation. He runs. She claims she hired a consultant for legitimate business intelligence work and had no knowledge of what he did beyond that. She knew. Of course she knew, but knowing and proving are different things," Adrian said. "I know." He looked at the ceiling, the dog-shaped stain. "What about the payment record, the $40,000? Her attorneys are already preparing an argument that it was an authorized payment for cybersecurity consulting. The contractor who received it has a legitimate business entity with a website and client history." Miles's voice was dry. "It's a good construction. It won't hold up to sustained forensic examination, but it complicates the direct link." "So she gets out on the murder charge?" "Potentially. The fraud charges are solid. The conspiracy charges are strong. The attempted murder..." He stopped. "Without Hargrove, it's circumstantial. She'll argue she hired consultants. She'll argue she didn't know what they did. She'll put Price in front of a jury, and Price will build reasonable doubt from exactly the gap between her and the contractor." Adrian's left hand tightened on the blanket. He felt the movement, controlled, deliberate, the result of 15 days of rebuilding one nerve connection at a time. And he felt the rage behind it, cold as before, but now carrying the specific additional weight of knowing that the person responsible for Theo's death might walk away from that particular charge intact. "Is there anything else?" he said. Miles looked at him with the expression of a man who'd known him for 16 years and recognized what was happening behind his eyes. "Yes," he said. "Vivian's attorneys filed a motion this morning to have the board meeting postponed. They're arguing that the circumstances around your recovery, the non-reporting of your conscious state, the informal communication channel through a nurse, constitute procedural irregularities that compromise the integrity of the emergency measures taken. Adrian stared at him. They're arguing, Miles said carefully, that because Hannah Mercer didn't follow standard protocol when she observed signs of consciousness, and because she facilitated communication between you and outside counsel without hospital administration authorization, the injunctions and account freezes may be challengeable. He paused. It won't work, but it buys time, and during that time, 3 of the frozen accounts are in jurisdictions where the legal challenge could create a 48 to 72-hour window in which the freeze is technically suspended pending re-adjudication. They move the money in that window. That's the play. The rage was very cold now, very precise. Adrian thought about Vivian in the holding facility, consulting with Price, still running plays from inside a cage. He thought about Hannah Mercer, who had paid attention when no one else had, who had made a card from cardstock and covered it in clear tape and spent 40-minute sessions pointing at letters in the dark, being used now as a procedural lever to claw back what remained of a plan that had already failed. They're going after Hannah, he said. Professionally, yes. The motion implies she acted improperly. If the hospital administration responds to the legal pressure by disciplining her or questioning her conduct, it strengthens Vivian's procedural argument. Adrian sat up. It cost him. His body registered the movement with a full accounting of what 15 days of immobility had done. His core was unreliable. His right arm didn't respond the way he expected, and the room briefly considered tilting before he controlled it. But he sat up. Miles watched him without moving to help. Get the hospital's legal team on the phone, Adrian said. Right now, not tomorrow, so this afternoon. And get Dr. Forsyth in here. For what purpose? Forsyth is going to provide a formal statement that Hannah Mercer's actions were consistent with responsible clinical observation and appropriate escalation under ambiguous neurological circumstances. His voice was steady. The room had stopped tilting. She's going to state that the non-immediate reporting of potential conscious indicators in a high-profile patient in a compromised environment was a defensible judgment call made in the patient's best interest. Forsyth may not. Forsyth is a professional, Adrian said. She'll say what's true. What Hannah did was observe, document, and protect a patient she believed was at risk. That is the truth, and Forsyth knows it. He paused. And then I'm going to give a statement to the hospital board directly, not through counsel. From me. Miles looked at him for a moment. The board meeting can't be postponed, Adrian said. Not by 48 hours. Not by 1 hour. Because if those accounts open for even a window, I understand the risk. Then fix it. Miles nodded once, the nod of a man who had been given a task and intended to complete it, and reached for his phone. He was already dialing as he moved toward the door. Adrian sat in the middle of the bed with his legs over the side and his feet not quite reaching the floor and the room solid around him, and he breathed. His right hand was weak. His core was unreliable. He had 60 hours before the board meeting, and somewhere in the architecture of Vivian's defense was a trap he hadn't fully seen yet, because a woman who'd planned a car crash to look like a cascade failure didn't build plans with only one layer. He thought about Hargrove in Zurich. Passport used. Then nothing. He thought about the $40,000 and the $60,000 and the specific care of a construction designed to be cut away. He thought about Vivian, who was many things but not stupid. He thought, what else did she build? The answer came to him not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. A cold drop in his stomach, the specific feeling of a wrong angle snapping into focus. He picked up the phone Miles had left on the tray table and he called Miles back, and Miles picked up on the first ring. The succession documents, Adrian said. The ones she was preparing before I woke up. Where are they now? A pause. In federal evidence custody, Miles said. Why? All of them. All that we've identified, yes. All that we've identified. Miles, Adrian said. She brought lawyers to my room 2 days ago. 2 men I didn't recognize. They're not on any of the documentation we've discussed. They came with their own portfolio. Silence on the line. I need to know who those men were, Adrian said. Not who they work for. Who they are. Because Vivian doesn't use the same lawyers for everything. She layers. And if those two men were carrying documents that weren't part of the main proxy package, then there's a set of filings somewhere that we haven't... Hold on, Miles said. The sound of rapid movement on his end. A door. Voices. Adrian waited. When Miles came back, his voice had changed in a specific way that Adrian had heard exactly twice in 16 years. The voice of a man looking at something he'd missed. The hospital's security footage from the day before you woke, Miles said. The two lawyers you're describing. They left the building, standard exit, but one of them made a stop on the second floor before going to the parking structure. A pause. The second floor houses the hospital's administrative office, including the notary on staff. The cold in Adrian's stomach spread. They filed something, Adrian said. I'm looking at the notary's log right now, Miles said. There's a document submission logged at 4:47 p.m. 2 days ago, 40 minutes before you opened your eyes. His voice was very controlled. It's logged under a patient file number, not a name. I need 20 minutes to pull it, Adrian said. He sat on the edge of the bed and he waited. And outside the window, the city did its indifferent business, and somewhere in the hospital's administrative system was a document that Vivian had filed 40 minutes before everything fell apart. A document he hadn't known to look for, built into the plan as the last layer, the cutaway piece, the thing that would still be standing after everything else had. The 20 minutes Miles asked for became 35. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed and counted them. His feet were flat on the cold floor. He'd lowered himself the rest of the way without planning to, some instinct pulling him toward solid ground, toward the specific sensation of weight and contact that 15 days of floating in a monitored bed had stripped away. His right hand rested on his knee. His left gripped the bed rail with a steadiness that surprised him. The room was quiet except for the monitor, which had been moved to the wall mount now that he was sitting upright, its rhythm unchanged, indifferent as always to whatever was happening in the room it recorded. He thought about Vivian at 4:47 in the afternoon, 2 days ago. He'd been awake. He'd known she was there. He'd been tracking the sounds of the room, her breathing, the shift of her weight in the chair, the occasional soft percussion of her fingers against her phone screen. He'd been waiting for Miles, who had been 40 minutes out. He'd been calculating the margin, and 40 minutes before Miles had walked through that door, Vivian had sent 2 men to the second floor. He hadn't known. He'd been in the room, awake, tracking everything, and he hadn't known because he couldn't track what he couldn't hear, and the second floor was 2 floors below, and whatever those men had done in the administrative office had been done quietly, professionally, without anything to hear. That was the thing about Vivian's construction. It wasn't improvised. It wasn't reactive. It had been built in advance, layered the way load-bearing structures were layered, redundantly, so that the failure of any single component didn't bring down the whole. She'd planned for the possibility of being caught. She'd planned for the possibility of Adrian waking up. She'd built a last piece that operated independently of her presence, her instruction, her freedom. Miles called back at 5:43. "It's a pre-signed medical directive," he said. His voice had the quality of controlled precision that meant he was angry and not showing it. "Dated 6 weeks ago. Notarized by a private notary. Not the hospital's staff. A private notary whose seal was used to file the document here. It establishes a secondary medical proxy authority vesting decision-making power in a holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands. The holding entity is controlled by a trustee whose identity is shielded behind 2 additional corporate layers." Adrian said nothing. "The directive was filed with the hospital as a supplementary advance care document," Miles continued. "Under current hospital administrative policy, supplementary directives received prior to a patient regaining legally confirmed conscious capacity are entered into the patient's file and are technically operative until formally revoked by the patient in writing with independent witness confirmation." A pause. "The document was filed at 4:47. You didn't produce a legally confirmed statement of conscious capacity until Miles arrived with the federal investigators at 5:26, Adrian said. "Yes." 39 minutes. "Yes." "What decisions were made in those 39 minutes?" The silence on the line was exactly 2 seconds long, and Adrian had known Miles for 16 years and knew what 2 seconds of silence from Miles Donovan meant. One, Miles said. A single authorization was processed through the holding entity in the window between document filing and your recovery confirmation. It authorized the release of a specific asset package from Vail Industries' subsidiary holdings, a real estate development portfolio in the company's infrastructure division, 11 properties. Current combined valuation. He stopped. $412 million. The number sat in the room. Adrian's grip on the bed rail tightened. Where did it go? He said. The authorization directed a sale to a private acquisition entity. The sale price was listed at $43 million. $43 million, Adrian said, for $400 million in assets. The acquisition entity is owned by a beneficial interest holder whose identity is also shielded, but the structure, Miles paused. The structure is identical to the Cayman holding entity. Same formation documents, same registered agent, different name. It's a sale from one of her entities to another. She moved $400 million in assets out of Vail Industries into her own control for a fraction of their value through a directive filed before you were legally awake, in a window she'd calculated she had, using a notary and a filing structure she'd put in place 6 weeks ago. The cold in Adrian's chest was complete now. Total. The rage was there, but it was underneath the cold compressed by it, and what was on top was something he didn't have an immediate name for. The specific sensation of recognizing the full architecture of something you'd been standing inside without knowing its dimensions. She'd done it anyway, even after the arrest, even after Miles had walked in with federal investigators, even after everything had collapsed, the proxy documents, the forged signatures, the frozen accounts, the conspiracy charges. She'd done it anyway, because she'd planned for exactly this outcome. Because the last piece had been in motion before she'd ever walked into his room that final afternoon, before she'd placed the papers under his hand, before she'd had to watch his eyes open. She'd built a component that operated independently, that would execute regardless of what happened to her, and it had executed with 39 minutes of legal breathing room, and $400 million in real estate assets were now sitting in an entity she controlled from whatever holding facility she was in, awaiting the inevitable protracted legal battle over whether the directive had been valid, whether the sale had been legitimate, whether the window had been real. He sat on the edge of the bed, and he thought very carefully. "Can we reverse it?" he said. "We're filing an emergency motion tonight. Fraudulent conveyance. The $43 million price on $400 million in assets is so far below market value it's essentially dispositive on the question of legitimate intent. But the acquisition entity will contest. Their attorneys, and they'll have attorneys already, because this was planned, will argue the directive was validly filed, the sale was a legitimate market transaction between willing parties, and that the beneficial interest structure is a standard privacy mechanism with no inherent legal infirmity." Miles exhaled. "We'll win. Eventually. But eventually means months, maybe a year, during which time those assets are technically in contested limbo, and Vail Industries is operating with a $400 million hole in its balance sheet that the board, the banks, and the public markets are going to notice." "The board meeting," Adrian said, "is now significantly more complicated," Miles said, "because it's not just about restoring your authority anymore. It's about stabilizing a company that is going to look, to anyone examining it from the outside, like it has been severely compromised. And there are board members who are going to use that instability as an argument for a different kind of transition than the one we've been planning." Adrian heard what Miles wasn't quite saying. "Who?" he said. "Bertrand Lyle called me 40 minutes ago, before I'd even confirmed the filing. He'd already heard." Miles paused. "He's proposing an interim management structure, an outside executive brought in to stabilize while the legal situation resolves. He's framing it as protecting the company. He's framing it as a takeover," Adrian said. "He has 4 board votes confirmed, possibly 5 if Ose moves with him, against your 7, which becomes shakier given the asset situation." Miles's voice was level, but the effort of keeping it that way was audible. "Adrian, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. Vivian may be in custody, but she built this to keep running after she was caught, and it's running." The door opened. Adrian looked up. Hannah Mercer stood in the doorway. She was in street clothes, not scrubs, which meant she was here outside her shift, jeans and a dark jacket, her hair down in a way he hadn't seen before, and her expression had the specific quality of someone who'd received news they'd been trying not to expect. She looked at him sitting on the edge of the bed, looked at the phone in his hand. "I heard," she said. He waited. "Hospital administration called me this afternoon, before your attorney got to them." She came into the room, didn't sit, stood near the window with her arms crossed, not defensively, more like she was holding something in. "They're saying my handling of your case is under review. They're saying the proper protocol for reporting suspected consciousness is immediate notification through clinical channels, and that my decision to manage it the way I did constitutes a potential violation of patient care standards." She paused. They used the word liability. Adrian said, "Hannah, I'm not done." Her voice was steady, but there was something under it, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. "They also said that the attorney representing Vivian Cross has filed a formal complaint with the state nursing board, alleging that I facilitated unauthorized legal communication between a patient of uncertain capacity and outside counsel, which may have compromised the patient's legal interests." She paused again. "My license is under review." The cold in Adrian's chest moved. "I put miles on it this afternoon," he said. Forsyth is being careful," Hannah said. "I spoke to her an hour ago. She said she supports my clinical judgment, but that she needs to review the complete record before providing any formal statement, which is doctor, for I'm waiting to see which way this lands before I commit." The flatness in her voice was not bitterness, exactly. It was recognition, the sound of someone whose working theory about people has just been confirmed in the wrong direction. Adrian looked at her. The jacket, the dark under her eyes, the specific quality of someone who'd spent the day absorbing a sequence of blows and was still standing through the specific stubbornness of someone who didn't know what else to do. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "That's not what I came here for." "I know. I'm saying it anyway." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Is it true? About the assets?" "Yes." 400 million. "Yes." She absorbed that, looked out the window at the city doing its business. "She planned all of this?" "Yes." "She planned for getting caught?" "Yes." Hannah turned back to him. Her expression had shifted into something harder and more specific. "So what do you do?" It was not a rhetorical question. She asked it the way she'd asked everything, directly, with the expectation of a direct answer, without the social padding that people used to give themselves room to retreat from the response. Adrian's phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Miles. Lyle is calling an emergency board pre-meeting. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. He put the phone down. "I go to the board meeting," he said. "You can barely sit up." "I know." "They're going to look at you and see a man who spent 15 days in a hospital bed and came out into a company that's missing $400 million from its balance sheet and has federal investigations running in 3 directions." "Yes." "And you think you can hold that room?" He looked at her. "I've held worse rooms." She studied him for a moment with the look she'd developed over 15 nights. The specific attentiveness that wasn't assessment so much as reading. The ability to determine something true about the state of the person in front of her that had nothing to do with what they were saying. "You'll need to stand," she said, "not sit. If you walk into that room in a wheelchair, they'll decide the meeting before you speak. If you walk in under your own power, it changes the starting point." He hadn't said this to her. She'd arrived at it independently, which confirmed what he'd understood for 2 weeks. She thought structurally, in terms of how the physical facts of a situation communicated meaning before any words were exchanged. "Can you help me stand?" he said. "That's what I came for," she said. They worked for an hour. It was not elegant. His right leg was less reliable than his left, which Rosa had not fully prepared him for, and the first 3 attempts to bear his own weight produced a kind of liquid instability in his right knee that he had to compensate for by loading more pressure through his left side and gripping the bedrail with a force that left marks in his palm. Hannah stood beside him without touching him unless he was going to fall, which was the right call. He needed to find the balance himself, to understand where his weight actually sat now versus where he expected it to, and having someone hold him upright would have taught him nothing. He fell once. Controlled fall, caught on the rail, not the floor. She watched him get up. By the end of the hour, he could stand unsupported for 90 seconds. He could take 4 steps with a hand on the rail and 3 steps without. His right leg was unreliable under sustained load, but manageable under short effort. It wasn't enough for a board meeting. It would have to be. She left at 9. He did the exercises Rosa had given him, twice through, then a third time, pushing into the discomfort that Rosa had said was acceptable versus the sharper signal that meant stop. He found the edge of it and worked just below it. His body was not what it had been. He was recalibrating to a new floor, and the new floor was lower than he'd known himself to occupy, and the recalibration required a specific kind of surrender that had nothing to do with giving up, more like a soldier ditching weight to move faster. Accept the limitation. Work with what exists. Stop mourning the version of yourself that isn't here anymore. Miles came back at 10:30 with a woman he introduced as Reeves. Corporate crisis specialist, severe suit, the kind of competent that expressed itself as the total absence of unnecessary movement. She sat across from him and laid out the situation in the language of board dynamics. Who was movable? Who was fixed? What the asset crisis had done to the alignment? What arguments Lyle would lead with? What the probable vote count was without intervention. Without intervention, Reeves said, Lyle has 5 votes, and you have 5 votes, and 2 are genuinely undecided, which in practice means the undecideds break towards stability, which in a crisis means the known quantity rather than the embattled one. You lose the vote 7-5. What changes it? Adrian said. You, she said. In the room. Your physical presence, the quality of it, the specific authority you project when you speak. That's not a variable I can fully model because I haven't seen you in a room. But every person I've spoken to who has says the same thing, that there's something in the way you occupy a space that shifts the assumptions of the people in it. She paused. The question is whether you can produce that tomorrow morning. What else changes it? Grant Vale's testimony. If he walks through the full timeline, say Vivian's approach, the documents, the forged authorizations, in front of the board directly, it converts the narrative from embattled CEO in legal crisis to CEO who survived a sophisticated criminal conspiracy and is the most knowledgeable person in the room about what was done to his company. She paused again. And the Hargrove connection. If Delaney can produce something concrete on Hargrove before 8 a.m., she can't, Adrian said. He's in Zurich. Then we work without it. Miles leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. There's another option, he said. Adrian looked at him. Postpone, Miles said. Request a 30-day stabilization period under a neutral administrator while the legal proceedings advance. It's not surrender. It's strategic consolidation. Let the fraud case develop. Let the asset reversal proceed. Come back to the board in 30 days with a resolved legal picture instead of a contested one. In 30 days, Adrian said, Lyle builds a coalition that becomes structural. In 30 days, the board becomes accustomed to operating without me. In 30 days, whoever Vivian's beneficial interest trustee is moves those assets in ways that make them harder to reverse. He paused. Postponing is losing slowly instead of quickly. I'd rather win ugly tomorrow than lose cleanly next month. Miles said nothing. Reeves made a note. Get me everything on Lyle, Adrian said. Every vote he's made in the last 3 years. Every position he's taken on the major decisions. The infrastructure division, the overseas expansion, the refinancing package from last spring. I want to understand what he's been building toward, because a man with 5 board votes doesn't assemble them overnight. Reeves looked at him. You think Lyle was working with Vivian. I think Vivian was thorough, Adrian said. I think a woman who planned a car crash and a fraudulent directive, and a Cayman holding entity, and a private notary, and a Zurich exit route 6 months in advance also thought about who would be useful to have on a board when everything went sideways. He paused. Find the connection. They left at midnight. He sat in the dark and went through the board member profiles Miles had left him, reading each one with the specific attention of a man who had spent 15 days recalibrating what attention meant, turning each biographical and voting record over for the angles he'd previously looked past. The exercises, the profiles, the exercises again. At 2 in the morning, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost let it go. Something made him answer. The voice on the other end was male, calm in the specific way of someone in a controlled environment, not relaxed, controlled. Background sound, air circulation, a slight echo. Institutional, not American. Mr. Vale, the voice said. My name is Hargrove. Adrian went still. I'm calling because I think you're about to walk into a board meeting tomorrow with the wrong information, Hargrove said. And I have, let's call it a professional interest in ensuring certain facts are understood before decisions are made. Where are you? Adrian said. That's not relevant to the conversation. It is to the federal investigators who'd like to speak with you. I'm sure it is. A pause. Mr. Vale, I was hired to coordinate an operation. I did so. I'm not going to discuss the specifics of that operation with you or with anyone in a United States jurisdiction, which is why I'm not in a United States jurisdiction. What I will tell you is this: Vivian Cross didn't hire me. The room was very quiet. She made the introduction, Hargrove said. She facilitated the contract, and she provided the operational intelligence, your driver's schedule, the vehicle service records, the access window. But the entity that retained me, that paid me, that specified the outcome they wanted, it wasn't her. Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. Then who? He said. Hargrove was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, measuring, the pause of a man deciding exactly how much of a thing to say. Someone who has been on your board for 4 years, he said. Someone who understood that Vivian Cross and her ambitions were a useful instrument. Someone who needed her to succeed enough to create the legal and financial chaos that would allow a different kind of acquisition to proceed. The kind that doesn't require forged signatures, just a destabilized company and a willing buyer. A pause. Someone who is currently presenting himself as the voice of stability. The cold in Adrian's stomach was absolute. Lyle, Adrian said. The introduction was made through a law firm he controls, Hargrove said. The primary payment came from a fund he manages through a nominee. Vivian thought she was running the operation. She was the operation. She was the instrument. She doesn't know who was actually paying. Another pause. I'm telling you this because I was paid to facilitate a murder, Mr. Vale. I coordinated the access to your vehicle. A man died. And the person who is most responsible for that is about to stand up in a boardroom and propose himself as the solution to the crisis he engineered. The line was silent. Why are you telling me this? Adrian said. Because I'm going to be found eventually, Hargrove said. And when I am, I intend to be found as a cooperating witness rather than a fugitive. I'm negotiating my position. This call is part of that negotiation. He paused. I'll be sending documentation to your attorney within the hour. Financial records, communication logs, the formation documents for the fund that paid me. It's enough to establish the connection. What you do with it before 8 a.m. tomorrow is your concern. The line went dead. Adrian sat in the dark with the phone in his hand and the monitor beeping its rhythm and the city outside the window doing its indifferent business and the specific sensation of the floor shifting under a structure you'd thought you understood. Lyle. Not Vivian's operation. Vivian's participation. Vivian, who had wanted his company and his wealth and had been given the tools and the access and the plan by a man who wanted something larger. A destabilized company. A manufactured crisis. A board vote and the chaos that would let him move a $3 billion industrial firm into the hands of whoever the willing buyer was, at whatever the crisis price was, while Vivian took the legal exposure, and Hargrove took the exit, and Lyle stood in the boardroom in his correct suit and proposed himself as the voice of reason. Theo had died for a board acquisition. The rage was no longer cold. He called Miles. Miles picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. Hargrove called me, Adrian said. Silence. He's sending you documentation, financial records connecting Lyle to the fund that paid him. Get Delaney on the phone the moment it arrives. He paused. And Miles, I need you to understand something. Tell me. Tomorrow morning I'm walking into that boardroom, Adrian said. Not rolling in, not being assisted in, walking in. And I'm going to look at Bertrand Lyle across that table, and I'm going to dismantle everything he's built in that room piece by piece in front of the people he thought were his. His voice was steady. Not cold anymore. Something past cold. Something that had moved through cold into a temperature that didn't have a common name. I need everything Hargrove sends. I need Delaney's confirmation before 8, and I need Grant in that room ready to speak. Adrian? Miles. A pause. I'll make the calls, Miles said. Adrian put the phone down. He stood up from the bed. It took 3 attempts. The right leg unreliable as always, the room requiring a moment to stabilize. And he stood in the center of the hospital room in the dark, and he breathed. His body was damaged, his company was bleeding. The man who'd engineered his murder was currently preparing a board presentation 40 minutes across. The documentation from Hargrove arrived at 3:47 in the morning. Miles called 11 minutes later. Adrian was already awake, already sitting upright in the bed with the room's single reading light on, doing the hand exercises Rosa had given him with the methodical repetition of a man who had decided that sleep was no longer a variable he could afford. His right hand was responding better than the night before, marginally, measurably better, the grip closing with something approaching its former speed. He told himself this mattered. He made himself believe it. I have it, Miles said. His voice had the stripped quality of a man 4 hours past his last sleep. Hargrove sent 3 packages: financial records from the fund, formation documents, capital contributions, wire transfer logs. The fund is called Meridian Structured Capital. It's registered in the Cayman Islands, same jurisdiction as the holding entity Vivian used, different registered agent. 11 investors. The beneficial interest structure hides the controlling party behind 2 nominee layers, but the wire transfers to Hargrove's operating account were authorized through a subaccount with a signatory code that traces back. He stopped. The pause of a man reading and speaking simultaneously. It traces back to a law firm called Carver Pellman Associates. They're registered in Delaware. They have 4 listed partners. Is Lyle one of them? Adrian said. No, but Bertrand Lyle's personal holding company, BLV Capital Management, appears in Carver Pellman's client register as an advisory relationship going back 6 years. And one of the 4 listed partners at Carver Pellman was Lyle's personal attorney for 9 years before Carver Pellman was formed. Miles exhaled. It's not a direct line. It's 3 steps. But each step is documented. Is it enough for Delaney? I called her 20 minutes ago. She says it's enough to open a formal investigation into Lyle's connection. It is not enough to arrest him before 8 a.m. A pause. She's moving on it. But moving on it and stopping a board meeting are different scales of intervention. Adrian looked at the window. The city was dark still, the pre-dawn dark that had no warmth in it, the dark before things started up again. What about the vote count? He said. Reeves has been working her contacts since midnight. With Hargrove's documentation, we can present the Lyle connection as a formal allegation in the meeting. That changes the dynamic for the undecided members. Nobody wants to vote with a man who's about to be federally investigated. Miles paused. But Lyle doesn't know we have it yet. If he walks into that room not knowing, his opening position is built on the assumption that he still controls the narrative. Good, Adrian said. I want him to walk in not knowing. Silence on the line. Adrian, Miles said, I need to say something. Say it. You are 17 days out of a traumatic brain injury. You have incomplete motor function on your right side. You haven't slept. You are about to attempt to walk into a board meeting and conduct what is functionally a simultaneous counter-coup and criminal exposure against a man who has been preparing this for months. His voice was not dramatic. It was the voice of a man stating true things. I need you to tell me you understand the physical cost of what today requires. Because if you collapse in that room, I won't collapse. If you do, Miles. Adrian's voice was flat. I heard Vivian tell me to die from 8 inches away. I communicated through an alphabet card for 2 weeks with one finger. I've been planning this since day 4 of lying in a bed while someone dismantled everything I built. He paused. I'm not going to collapse in the boardroom. A long silence. I'll have a car there at 7:15, Miles said. He arrived at 7:20. Adrian was dressed. Miles had sent clothes the previous evening, a suit that was correct without being formal, the specific register of a man who takes meetings seriously without performing seriousness. The dressing had taken longer than expected. His right hand had struggled with buttons. He'd managed them all, one at a time, with the patience of a man who had learned patience the hardest possible way. He stood when Miles walked in, stood without the rail, 3 seconds unsupported before he shifted his weight onto his left leg. Miles looked at him. Didn't say anything about the standing, just handed him a folder. Hargrove's summary, Delaney's preliminary case notation, Grant's testimony package. He paused. There's one more thing. Tell me in the car. The car was a black sedan, not Adrian's usual. His usual had been replaced after the crash, and the replacement was still in evidence. The driver was someone Miles had sourced personally, which meant he'd been vetted in the specific way Miles vetted things. Adrian sat in the back and felt the city moving past the windows, and felt his right knee and thought about the boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Vail Industries Tower. The room he'd sat in 200 times, the room where he'd made the decisions that had built the company, and thought about walking into it today and what that room would feel like from the other side of 15 days of absolute darkness. The one more thing, he said. Miles turned to him. Patricia Osei called me at 6 this morning. She's not with Lyle. Adrian looked at him. She was approached by him 3 months ago. He offered her a seat on a restructured board under the new management structure, whatever the new structure was going to be post Vivian's takeover. She listened. She didn't commit. Miles's voice was careful. She called me this morning because she wanted to inform us that she has documentation of Lyle's approach. Dates, communication records, the specific terms he proposed. He paused. She's prepared to present it in the meeting. Why? She says she wants to be on the right side of it. Miles paused. I believe her. I also think she's smart enough to understand which side is going to win. Both of those things could be true simultaneously. Adrian had long since stopped requiring pure motives from useful allies. Tell her to be ready, he said. The Vail Industries Tower occupied a specific corner of the financial district that caught morning light in a particular way, the eastern face of the building going gold while the lobby remained in shadow, a contrast Adrian had noticed 100 times and never thought about. He noticed it now. He sat in the car outside the building for a moment and looked at it. Miles didn't rush him. Then Adrian opened the door and got out and stood on the sidewalk in the early morning cold and looked at the building that had his name on it, that he had built from a Cleveland rental office into a $3 billion enterprise over 20 years, that someone had spent the better part of a year trying to take from him by the most direct method available and then by the most constructed and legal method available, and he felt the specific quality of standing in front of something that was yours and knowing that the next 2 hours would determine whether it stayed that way. His right knee held. He walked into the lobby. The security desk, 2 men he recognized, who recognized him with a visible start, the contained alarm of people who'd been told the CEO was recovering and hadn't quite calibrated for him walking in at 7:40 in the morning, nodded, processed his identity, and called ahead. The elevator to the executive floor required a key card. His key card had been in his desk when the crash happened. Miles produced it from the folder. The elevator moved. Adrian stood without holding the wall. The 42nd floor had the particular quiet of early arrival. Assistants at their stations, low voices, coffee brewing somewhere. The conference room at the end of the corridor was visible through the glass partition, already occupied. He could see shapes, figures at the table, the specific body language of people in pre-meeting negotiation. He could see Lyle. Bertrand Lyle was 61 years old, compact and carefully maintained, with the kind of face that aged well because it had never been particularly expressive. He wore a dark suit, and he was standing at the head of the table, Adrian's seat, technically, or the seat nearest it, with a hand on the back of the chair and his weight forward, speaking to 2 board members who were leaning in, the body language of people being organized. He had the bearing of a man who had already decided how the morning would go. He had not yet seen the corridor. Adrian stood at the glass for 2 seconds. Then he pushed open the conference room door. The room moved. Not all at once. It was a ripple, starting nearest the door and traveling the length of the table. Faces turning, bodies shifting. the specific rearrangement of people recalibrating in real time. One of the assistants near the credenza said something that was cut off by the silence that followed it. Lyle turned last. His face did something complex and very fast, a sequence of adjustments that began with surprise and moved through something that was not quite fear and settled on the professional neutrality of a man in control of his expression. But Adrian had watched Vivian perform control for 14 months, and he knew the difference between genuine composure and maintained composure, and what was on Lyle's face was maintenance. "Adrian," Lyle said. His voice was warm, calibrated. We didn't expect you to be." "I know," Adrian said. He moved to the head of the table. His right leg was manageable. He stood behind his chair and looked at the room. 12 board members, 3 of whom were Lyle's, and 2 of whom were undecided, and 4 of whom were solidly his, and 1 of whom was Patricia Osei, who was sitting very still at the far end of the table with her hands flat on the surface, and her eyes on Adrian with the specific quality of a woman who had made a decision and was holding to it. Grant was near the door. He'd come in behind Miles. He stood without sitting, which was right. Grant understood the geometry of the room. Adrian said, "Sit down, everyone. We're going to move quickly this morning." Most of them sat. Lyle sat last, which was a tell. The reluctance of a man being directed into a position he'd planned to occupy differently. "I'm going to table the agenda that was circulated," Adrian said. "Before we discuss any structural questions about the company's leadership, there are 3 pieces of information this board needs to hear." He looked at Miles, who was standing near the door with the folder. Miles placed 3 bound documents on the table, one in front of Adrian, one in front of Osei, one in the center where the undecided members sat. "These are Hargrove's financial records," Adrian said. "Hargrove is the man who coordinated the tampering with my vehicle. The tampering that killed my driver, Theodore Garland, and was intended to kill me." He let that sit for a moment. Let the room be still with it. "These records trace the payment for that operation through a fund called Meridian Structured Capital, through a law firm called Carver Pellman Associates, to a controlling interest held by a member of this board." The room changed. It was physical. The way temperature changed, the way pressure changed. He felt it in his chest. Lyle said, "Don't," Adrian said. Lyle stopped. "Patricia," Adrian said. Osei opened the folder in front of her. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at the room. Her voice was steady and impersonal. 3 months ago, I was contacted by Bertrand Lyle and offered a position on a restructured board. The approach was predicated on the assumption that Vail Industries would undergo a leadership transition in the near term. He used the phrase, "when the dust settles." He specified that the company would likely be acquired by a private equity consortium and that the restructured board would need members who understood the new ownership's priorities. She paused. "I have the communication records. They're in the folder in front of each of you." The room was very quiet. Lyle's face had moved past maintenance into something rawer. His jaw was set. His hands on the table were still, too still, the stillness of deliberate suppression. He looked at Adrian with the specific quality of a man calculating exits and finding them closed one by one. "This is fabricated," Lyle said. His voice had lost the warmth. "Whatever Hargrove is, whoever he is, he's a man who was arrested by federal agents and has every incentive to point his cooperation in whatever direction reduces his exposure. He hasn't been arrested," Adrian said. "He called me voluntarily from outside U.S. jurisdiction. He's negotiating his position, which means his documentation needs to hold up under scrutiny because his deal depends on it being verifiable." He paused. "It's verifiable." "You have no—" "Bertrand." Adrian's voice dropped. Not louder, quieter. The specific quiet of someone who doesn't need volume because the room is already listening. "I spent 15 days unable to move or speak. I lay in a bed while the woman you used as your instrument sat next to me and instructed attorneys and moved assets and told me to hurry up and die." Something moved through his voice, not emotion exactly, but the residue of it, the specific weight of a man speaking about something that is not abstract. "I was present for every phone call, every transaction, every piece of the construction you and she built together, and I had nothing to do for 15 days but remember it. He paused. You made a mistake. You assumed I couldn't hear you. Lyle looked at him. Something in his face was breaking apart. Not collapsing, but fracturing, the controlled surface cracking under a pressure it had been built to withstand, but not this specific pressure. He looked around the table, and what he found there was the specific isolation of a man whose coalition has already moved. Not dramatically, not with announced defection, but in the way rooms moved, in the incremental repositioning of bodies and expressions toward the gravity of the person who was winning. I want independent counsel, Lyle said. You can have independent counsel, Miles said from the door, after the vote. There is no vote until... There is absolutely a vote, Adrian said. This board will vote this morning on the restoration of executive authority, the formal rejection of all proxy documentation submitted during my incapacitation, and the referral of evidence regarding board member conduct to the relevant federal authorities. He put both hands flat on the table. His right hand was shaking slightly. He held it flat through the shaking by the specific effort of a man who had learned over 17 days how to hold a thing steady against resistance. And before we vote, my brother is going to tell you exactly what he saw and heard and handled over the past 4 months. Grant moved from the door. He came to the center of the room and stood without notes, which Adrian had told him to do. Notes suggested preparation, and preparation suggested strategy, and what Grant needed to project was not strategy, but testimony, the specific unpolished quality of someone telling the truth because they have nothing left to protect. He was still thin. The tie was still slightly off. He looked at the table and then at the board members, and then for a moment at Adrian. Adrian nodded once. Grant talked for 22 minutes. He didn't editorialize. He didn't explain himself more than necessary. He laid out the timeline from the first conversation Vivian had initiated, through the documents, through the forged authorizations, through the moment he'd understood what he'd been part of, and the moment, 2 days ago, in a hospital room, that he'd said what he needed to say to someone he'd thought couldn't hear him. He described Vivian's approach, and her methods, and the specific language she'd used. He described the way she'd asked about Theo's schedule. He described his own choices and his own failures without the softening language people used when they were confessing in public. He just said what had happened. He said it plainly, and he didn't look away. When he finished, the room was silent. One of the undecided members, a woman named Clara Voss, who'd been on the board for 2 years and who Adrian had assessed as genuinely principled rather than strategically neutral, said, "I'd like to call the vote." Lyle said, "This board cannot vote under duress." "This board," Adrian said, "is voting right now." The vote took 4 minutes, 9-3. The 3 were Lyle's committed members, who voted against with the determined quality of people who had decided to stay in a burning building on principle. Everyone else voted to restore Adrian's authority, reject the proxy documentation, and refer the Hargrove financial records and Osei's communication documentation to federal authorities. Lyle sat through the count without moving. When it was finished, he looked at Adrian across the table with the stripped expression of a man whose plan had been 17 months in construction and was now completely gone. And what was in his eyes wasn't rage and wasn't fear. It was the cold recognition of a man understanding the specific nature and dimensions of his own failure. "You should have died," Lyle said, quietly, just to Adrian. The room heard it. "I know," Adrian said. "That was the mistake." Miles was on his phone before the final vote was counted, relaying the result to Delaney, whose team had been staged in the building's lobby since 7:50, based on a call Miles had made at 7:30, and not mentioned to Adrian until the vote was done. Delaney herself came up at 9:03, 2 agents with her, and the room handled it with the specific stunned professionalism of people watching something unprecedented occur in a space they'd always associated with predictable events. Lyle was escorted out. He didn't resist. He walked with the agents in the specific way of a man who had decided that dignity was the last variable he could still manage, and Adrian watched him go and felt none of the relief he'd expected to feel, only the exhausted residue of something concluded, the particular flatness of a battlefield after the engagement has ended. His right leg was shaking. He sat down in his chair. His chair at the head of his table, in his company. He sat down and he put his right hand on the arm of the chair and felt it shaking and breathed through it, 3 slow breaths, the way Hannah had shown him to manage the fatigue that came after sustained physical effort. Grant sat down 2 chairs away. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He said nothing, which was the right thing. Clara Voss said, "What do you need from us?" Adrian looked at her. He looked at the room, the remaining 9 board members, some shaken, some steady, all of them looking at him with the specific quality of people who have witnessed something they will be processing for a long time. "I need 60 days, he said. 60 days to address the asset situation, stabilize the balance sheet, and put an operational structure in place that doesn't have single points of failure. He paused. Then I need this board to do its job and hold me accountable for the results. That's what boards are for. Voss nodded. Someone else said, "Done." Miles was beside him, low enough that only Adrian could hear. Delaney wants a full statement this afternoon. Hargrove's deal is contingent on U.S. cooperation. She thinks she can have him on a flight back within 72 hours. Adrian nodded. And the asset reversal motion was filed at 7 this morning, Miles continued. The fraudulent conveyance argument is strong. The $43 million sale price is going to hold up in any court as evidence of non-legitimate transaction. We should have the freeze on those assets restored within... Miles, Adrian stopped him, looked at him. Later. Miles stopped, looked at him properly, the way he rarely did, the way that was actually seen rather than assessing. Then he nodded. The room began to move, people standing, talking, the specific kinetic release of a contained pressure finding its exits. Adrian sat in his chair and let it happen around him. His right leg had stopped shaking. His right hand had almost stopped. The morning light had moved around the building and was coming through the east-facing windows now, the same gold quality he'd seen from the car, and it was doing what morning light did, touching things neutrally, without commentary. He thought about Hannah. He thought about an alphabet card covered in clear tape, and a woman reading aloud in the dark like he was worth reading to, and the specific quality of attention that expected nothing back. He thought about Theo's daughter, 14 years old, with her grandmother. He thought about the 42 floors between him and the ground, and the city below going about its business, and the specific distance between who he'd been the morning before the crash, certain, armored, moving too fast to look at the people directly in front of him, and who he was now. The distance was not measurable in time or money or legal victories. He didn't have a name for it yet. He thought he might, eventually, if he paid the right kind of attention. Miles touched his shoulder. "Car's downstairs when you're ready." 5 minutes, Adrian said. He sat in his chair at the head of his table, and he looked at the city through the glass, and he breathed, and his hands were almost steady, and outside the door, the machinery of consequence was running. Federal agents and lawyers and financial forensics, and a man in Zurich calculating his surrender. And somewhere across the city in a parking structure, Hannah Mercer was probably arriving for her evening shift, slightly late, slightly out of breath, about to walk into a hospital room that no longer had him in it. And he thought about that for a moment. The empty room, the made bed, the monitor no longer needed, and what she would find there instead of a patient when she arrived, and whether she would look for what He left the building on his own 2 feet. That was the detail he would remember later. Not the vote count, not Lyle's face when the agents came, not the specific legal language of the motions filed and the accounts frozen and the charges enumerated. He would remember walking out of the Vail Industries Tower onto the morning sidewalk, his right leg unreliable but holding, the cold air hitting his face in the particular way that outside air hit you when you'd been inside too long, with a quality that was almost physical shock, and standing there for a moment on the concrete with the city moving past him and feeling, just feeling, without naming or cataloging or converting into action, what it meant to be vertical and breathing in the open air after 17 days of a ceiling and a monitor and the dog-shaped water stain. Miles was behind him. The car was at the curb. Adrian stood on the sidewalk for 30 seconds, and then he got in the car. The first thing he did was sleep. Not that night. Immediately. The car was still moving through the financial district when it caught him, the specific ambush of a body that has held itself together past its limit and releases the moment the pressure drops. He was asleep before they cleared the first intersection, and he didn't wake until the car was parked outside the rehabilitation facility Miles had arranged, and the driver was saying his name quietly from the front seat. He slept for 14 hours that night. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. That was the truth of it, the part that didn't make the narrative clean. The asset reversal took 11 weeks, not the 30 days Miles had projected. The fraudulent conveyance argument held, and the $43 million transaction was struck down by a federal judge whose opinion used the phrase transparent artifice in a way that Miles said would be cited for years. But the holding entities contested at every stage, and each stage cost time and legal resources, and the sustained attention of people whose sustained attention was needed for 100 other things simultaneously. The $400 million in real estate assets were returned to Vail Industries in pieces, not all at once. The portfolio reassembled property by property over 3 months, like a thing that had been broken and was being put back together with hands that weren't quite steady. Vivian Cross was charged with corporate fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy in the first degree relating to the death of Theodore Garland. Harmon Price mounted the defense Adrian had anticipated: disciplined, expensive, built on the gap between her and Hargrove and the legitimate-seeming construction of the payments. The attempted murder charge was the hardest one to hold. Price worked the reasonable doubt in that charge with the specific skill of a man who knew exactly where the evidentiary weakness was and how to put sustained pressure on it. Hargrove came back. He landed at JFK on a Thursday morning, accompanied by a Swiss attorney and a pre-negotiated cooperation agreement. He was calm in the way of a man who had made his calculation and committed to it. He sat across from Delaney for 11 hours over 2 days and told her everything: the approach from Carver Pellman, the specific instructions, the access arrangements for the vehicle, the names of the 2 men who had done the physical work. He gave her the communication records. He gave her the encrypted backup of his operational files, which contained a chain of instruction that ran from the technical execution back through 3 intermediary steps to Lyle and to Vivian, and to a conversation that Hargrove had recorded on his own initiative, he said, as professional insurance. In the recording, Vivian's voice said, "I need it to look like the car failed. I need it to be the car, not anything else." That recording was 14 seconds long. It was enough. The attempted murder charge held. Vivian received 19 years. She sat in the courtroom when the sentence was read with the same controlled expression she had maintained throughout the trial. And when the judge finished speaking, she looked straight ahead for a moment, and then, very briefly, looked at Adrian, who was seated in the gallery. He looked back. There was nothing in her face that he recognized as remorse. What he saw was something closer to the cold acknowledgement of one chess player to another when the game has concluded. A recognition of outcome without concession of the thing underneath it. She held his gaze for 2 seconds, then looked away and was escorted out. And that was the last time he saw her. Bertrand Lyle received 23 years. His sentencing came 6 weeks after Vivian's, following a trial that had the specific quality of a highly constructed thing coming apart under the examination of its own details. Each corporate layer peeled back, each nominee revealed, each wire transfer logged against the timeline of events. His attorney had been better than Price in certain technical respects, and it hadn't mattered because Hargrove's records were specific, and the judge was not inclined toward mercy for a man who had financed a murder from behind 3 corporate shells and then presented himself to a board as the solution to the crisis. Lyle said nothing when the sentence was read. He stood with the stillness of a man who had decided, somewhere in the preceding months, that there was nothing left worth saying. He was escorted out the same door Vivian had been. Adrian sat in the gallery both times, and he felt, both times, the same thing. Not satisfaction exactly, more the specific exhaustion of a conclusion that had cost more than it should have been required to cost. The law had worked. The evidence had held. The construction had come apart under scrutiny as thoroughly as it deserved. And Theo Garland was still dead, and the system that had just worked correctly could not address that fact in any way that reached the thing that mattered. He visited Theo's family 2 months after the board meeting. He'd asked Miles to arrange it without telling him how. Miles had made contact through the family's attorney, framed it as a condolence visit from the employer, kept the language neutral. The grandmother, Eleanor Garland, 68, a retired school teacher from the south side of the city, had agreed to see him. The apartment was in a building that had seen better decades. The elevator was unreliable, and Adrian took the stairs, his right leg managing 4 flights with the specific effortful steadiness of someone who had been working on it every day for 2 months. Eleanor Garland opened the door herself. She was compact and direct, and she looked at him with the kind of eyes that had been looking at people clearly for a long time and had no interest in pretending otherwise. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Mrs. Garland," he said. "Thank you for seeing me." She let him in. The apartment was clean and small and had photographs on every available surface. Family photographs, the kind that accumulated in homes where the living of a life was considered worth documenting. He looked for Theo's face and found it across the span of years, from childhood through the adult man Adrian had known as a professional presence in the front seat of a car. Amara was there. Theo's daughter was 14 years old, and she had her father's specific quality of stillness, not passive, but contained, the stillness of someone who was paying attention to more than they were showing. She sat on the couch and she looked at Adrian with an expression that was not hostile, but was not soft. The expression of a child who had been required by events to stop being entirely a child, and who understood, at some level, what this visit was. They sat at the kitchen table. Eleanor made coffee. Adrian accepted it. He said, "I want you to know that your son's death was not an accident and that the people responsible for it have been held accountable. That's not enough. I know it's not enough. But I needed to say it to you directly." Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. "The lawyers told us about the charges." "I know. I wanted to say it myself." She looked at him. "Theodore was proud of his work," she said. "He talked about you sometimes, not often. He wasn't a talker, but sometimes." She paused. "He said you were someone who noticed things." Adrian felt something move in his chest. "I didn't notice enough," he said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I don't suppose you did." It was not forgiveness, and it was not accusation. It was just true, stated plainly by a woman who had made her peace with the full weight of the world and its failures. And Adrian sat with it the way you had to sit with certain true things, without deflection, without the instinct to mitigate. He told them about the fund he'd established, education for Amara through whatever level she chose to pursue, housing security for Eleanor as long as she needed it, not a settlement, not a legal obligation, a direct commitment, documented and irrevocable, with Miles as the trustee and Amara as the sole beneficiary. He said it in plain language, without the softening that made these conversations easier for the person delivering them and harder for the person receiving them. Amara looked at him for the first time directly when he described the educational component. She said, "I want to study engineering." "Then you'll study engineering," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. She had her father's stillness. "He talked about you," she said. "He said you worked too hard and didn't look up enough." Adrian looked at her, 14 years old, containing more than she should have to contain. "He was right," Adrian said. He left an hour later. He walked down the 4 flights and out into the afternoon and stood on the sidewalk outside the building, and the city went past, and he did not move for a moment, just stood there, breathing the specific air of a neighborhood that didn't know his name and didn't need to. Grant found his footing slowly, which was the honest way to find it. He remained at Vale Industries in a restructured role, not the position he'd held before, which had carried title without accountability, but a genuinely operational position in the infrastructure division with real metrics and real consequences. He proposed it himself, which was how Adrian had known the proposal was serious. He'd walked into Adrian's office one morning 6 weeks after the board meeting and laid out the terms of his own accountability. Specific deliverables, specific timeline, specific conditions under which he would consider himself to have earned backstanding rather than simply occupying it. Adrian had read the proposal. He'd said, "This is harder than what you had before." "Yes," Grant had said. "You know that." "Yes." He'd let a moment pass. "You wrote this yourself." "I wrote it myself." Adrian had looked at his stepbrother, still thin, probably always thinner than before, The crash, having taken something from him in the metabolic way, sustained guilt consumed people from the inside. But steadier. The tie was straight. "Start Monday," Adrian said. Grant had nodded. He'd moved toward the door and then stopped, which was becoming a habit. The pause before leaving, that meant there was one more thing. "I've been thinking about the chauffeur," he said. "Theo." "I know." "I can't fix it," Grant said. "I know I can't fix it, but I keep—" He stopped, started over. "Is there anything, any way I can be useful to them, to the family?" Adrian looked at him. "Amara wants to study engineering." Grant absorbed this. "I'll reach out to the Infrastructure Foundation. We have a scholarship program." "She's already covered," Adrian said, "but the program needs board volunteers, people who actually understand the work and can mentor." He paused. "If you're serious about being useful." "I'm serious," Grant said. "Then I'll give them your name." Grant left. Adrian sat in his office and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass and thought about the difference between people who said they were serious and people who showed it through the specific, unglamorous, ongoing work of following through, and thought that the crash, the terrible, deliberate, lethal crash, had at least clarified that distinction in the people around him with a precision he might otherwise have spent another 20 years not achieving. He thought this without gratitude for the suffering. The suffering had not been required. It had been imposed. The clarity that came from it was not a gift. It was just what was left after the burning, the way certain landscapes emerged from fire with their true topology finally visible. Dr. Forsyth cleared him for reduced clinical supervision in the 8th week. She did it with the same competent neutrality she brought to everything, reviewing his progress chart with the expression of a woman for whom numbers that exceeded expectation were satisfying in a purely professional way. "Your motor recovery is at 68% of pre-injury baseline," she said. "The trajectory suggests you'll reach 75 within another 6 weeks. Beyond that, we'll see." She paused. "Cognitive processing under high-stress conditions may remain slower than you're used to for some time, possibly permanently." "I've been managing," Adrian said. "I know, I've seen the board meeting reports." She made a note. "I want to be clear that what you did, the pace at which you returned to full professional function, was medically inadvisable and produced demonstrable physiological stress markers." "I know." "I'm saying it for the record." "Understood." She looked at him over the top of her clipboard with the expression she rarely deployed, the one that was almost human. "You should have died from the crash," she said. "Statistically, the injury profile, the time to treatment, the nature of the neurological damage, you should have died or remained in a persistent vegetative state." She paused. "I don't know what to attribute the outcome to." "Stubbornness," Adrian said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "That's not a clinical category." "No," he said, "but it's accurate." She discharged him from formal clinical supervision the following week. He called Hannah that evening. He'd called her twice since the board meeting. Once to tell her that the nursing board complaint had been withdrawn and that Forsyth had provided the formal statement. Once to tell her that the hospital administration had formally cleared her conduct and issued a written acknowledgement that her handling of the case had been appropriate. Both calls had been practical, the language of resolved problems, and both times she had said thank you in the flat, pragmatic tone of someone who was glad to have a thing concluded but did not intend to make it larger than it was. This call was different. She answered on the 3rd ring. He could hear the background sound of somewhere public, a street or a market, the ambient noise of a city going about its business. "Adrian," she said. "Hannah." He paused. He was sitting in his office, the city visible through the glass in the last light of the afternoon. "Are you free Saturday evening?" A pause on her end. "Not long." "For what?" "Dinner," he said. "Not a thank you dinner, not a business dinner, just dinner." He paused. "I want to find out what book you were reading that night, the one with Harbor in the title. I only caught part of it." Silence for a moment, then, "It's called The Night Harbor. It's out of print. I found it at an estate sale." "Is it good?" "The ending is better than I expected," she said. He thought about that, about endings that were better than expected. "Saturday," he said. Saturday, she said. He hung up, sat in the office. The city moved through its evening transformation, the light shifting from gold to gray to the particular amber of street lamps and lit windows, the specific beauty of a city that didn't know you were watching it and didn't need to perform. He thought about what he'd nearly lost, and what he'd actually lost, and the distance between those two things, which was considerable. He thought about Theo and Amara and Eleanor and Grant and Miles, and a 14-second recording, and a judge using the phrase transparent artifice in an opinion that would be cited for years. He thought about Vivian's face when the warmth left it, and Lyle's eyes across the board table when the exits closed, and the specific quality of a plan built to survive its own failure, meeting the specific quality of a man who had survived his. He thought about a laminated card, A through Z, covered in clear tape. He opened his desk drawer. He'd asked Hannah to keep the card. She'd kept it. But she'd left something in the hospital room. He'd found it when he'd gone back for his personal effects on the day of his formal discharge. A paperback, out of print, found at an estate sale, left on the tray table beside his bed with a folded page marking the place where she'd stopped reading aloud. He'd taken it without thinking about it too carefully. He'd finished it in the rehabilitation facility in the evenings, reading it the way she'd read it to him, without rush, with the specific attention of someone who understood that a story required presence, not just processing. The ending had been better than expected. He put the book on the corner of his desk where he'd see it. Outside, the city was fully dark now, lit from within the way cities were. The specific warm evidence of 10 million people living their lives in the proximity of each other, most of them not knowing anyone else's name, all of them contained in the same cold air and amber light, surviving by the various means available to them. Adrian Vale had survived by a margin that should not have existed. He had survived by the movement of one finger, by a woman who paid attention, by the cold and methodical refusal of a man who had nothing to do but think to stop thinking, by the uncomfortable fact that the people who'd built the most sophisticated plan he'd ever been required to overcome had made one mistake at the center of all the others. They had believed that the difference between a living man and a dead one was a medical report. It wasn't. The difference was smaller and harder, and more specific than that. He stood up from his desk, his right leg held. He picked up his jacket, turned off the lamp, and walked to the door. In the corridor outside his office, the building was quieting for the evening. Assistants going home, the mechanical sounds of a large structure settling into its overnight self. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor, and stood waiting, and the elevator came, and the doors opened, and he stepped inside. He rode it down 42 floors in the ordinary way that a man rode an elevator when he was simply leaving work at the end of a day that had not required him to fight for his life. And the doors opened on the lobby, and he walked out into the night. The city received him the way it received everyone, without recognition, without ceremony, without any particular interest in what had happened on the 42nd floor, or in a hospital room on the 8th floor of Sterling Memorial, or in a car on a Tuesday morning on a road where a 9-month-old vehicle had been made to fail. The city just went on. Adrian Vale went on with it. That was enough. That was, in the final accounting of everything it had cost and everything it had taken and everything it had clarified, exactly enough.